Miles is in Leicester. Hi, Miles.
Hi, Ian and the panel. Yeah, a quick couple of questions, if I may. Quickly, first of all, that since October, since Israel has gone into Gaza and started the bombing campaign going after Hamas, and first of all, the population was told from north move to the central of Gaza, then to move to the west, and then move to the south, move to Rafah. Now they're going into Rafah, and they started bombing Rafah. Israel has. Now, do the panel not think that we should enforce this ceasefire rather than just requesting Israel to? Because James Elder of the UNICEF spokesman just came on just a little while ago. I was listening to him, and he was in tears, and that made me shed a few tears. I'll be honest with you. And his description of what is exactly happening on the ground. He was there. He's been there, and he was talking about the children and the people there, like children who are completely dumbstruck. They are in absolutely traumatized. Some of them haven't spoken for 2 months with amputations, having been moved. They moved 6-7 times from this place to that place, and there's no facilities for any medication, no facilities for sanitation. There's no facilities to have a good night's rest, as it were. And they are absolutely mentally, physically exhausted.
How would you enforce a ceasefire that neither side has either proposed or would abide by?
The first thing I would say is that, we should stop Israel completely, prevent them from bombing Rafah at the moment. Because look, there's the 1.4 million people are there. They're saying 100.
Okay, Alicia Kearns, this is something that I'm sure your committee has concerned itself with. But, I mean, as I said to Miles, it's not easy to enforce a ceasefire that neither side either has said that they will abide by or would.
I think that's the difficulty. I completely understand the sentiment, but this idea that the UK can force Israel to do something, we are not living in the colonial era anymore. We had a vote at the UN Security Council for a Ramadan ceasefire, and the next day the US came out and said it was non-binding. It is incredibly difficult, but it is even harder when the US, one of the few countries that really does have some real might they could throw behind it, comes out and says it's non-binding. We are in a really difficult place, and I think it's really important that politicians don't simplify this by saying, well, the UK could force it. The UK has all the diplomatic tools to do this. We don't. That is just not realistic. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be raising our voices. We've had all of our ministers out in the Middle East over the last 2 weeks. Tariq Ahmed, the Middle East minister, was on the phone to the Qataris this afternoon. We're part of the negotiations to get a ceasefire in place. The UK is doing a lot of work behind the scenes. But I think we have to be really careful and not allow this narrative to set in that people are choosing to allow this conflict to continue and that we have the ability to force a ceasefire. That is just not realistic, as much as I understand why people want to see an end to the suffering.
What difference has David Cameron made since he's been Foreign Secretary? Because it seems to me that the position of the UK government has shifted quite dramatically in certainly the language that they're using towards Israel.
And language matters when it comes to diplomacy. I think what David has done is said, look, we are a friend to Israel. We want to see Israel be able to defend itself and no longer live in a place where it's under threat. But there are also limits to self-defence, which are set out in law that are determined by things like proportionality. I think he has been fundamental in putting pressure on Israel, saying that they can't go into Lebanon with a full-scale invasion. The reason they had not gone to Rafah for so long was that the UK and the US said, you will not do that. You've also seen sanctions. There was a load more sanctions announced 4 days ago, which most people haven't seemed to have noticed, against extremist setters who've been conducting appalling acts of violence against Palestinians, and aid access. The UK is one of the leading voices, one of the leading reasons why Kerem Shalom and some of the other aid routes were opened. So I do think with David, every door opens to him. Every country respects him. They want to see him in the room. The same with Tariq Ahmed, our Middle East minister. People really respect him. And the other bit of work, he said we support a two-state solution and we want to recognise Palestine as a state. That was a fundamental change in policy. And he's driving through the hard work behind the scenes. He is working with our Arab partners to work out what does a Palestinian Authority look like? How is it one without Hamas? How do we secure, as we saw the Palestinian president say, Israel that is safe and secure for the long term, and a Palestinian state that is also safe and secure for the long term.
Andy McDonald.
Well, we're in an absolute bind at the moment because there was an offer on the table, and I was just watching the families of the hostages urging Netanyahu to accept the deal that has been accepted by Hamas. But the question is about our role as a nation. I'm of the view that we do have an historical and legal obligation here. My father served in Gaza 45 to 47, and he thought the Palestinian people were getting a raw deal back then. But we're stuck in this loop in the House of Commons at the moment, with Andrew Mitchell coming to the dispatch box and telling us that Israel has the capacity to observe international humanitarian law. And quite frankly, nobody's bothered about the capacity to do it. It's whether they're actually doing it or not.
Do you believe they are?
I believe they're in breach. And I think what's going on here is just egregious. Of course, we accept Israel's right to defend itself. What happened on October the 7th was an appalling abomination. But this has long since stopped being justifiable self-defence when you've got 35,000 people dead, another 70-odd thousand injured, and such a massive proportion of women and children in amongst those casualty lists. So this is only going to get worse if this incursion into Rafah continues. That the slaughter of civilians, the death toll will rise. We have leverage. I know Alicia says we haven't got the instant solution, but there are things we can do which are important. Some of them symbolic, but in terms of our obligations under international humanitarian law, by the supply of arms to Israel, people say it's not significant.
It's tiny.
It's 15%. 15% of an aircraft can't fly without those bits.
That's not an accurate statistic.
Lockheed Martin openly said that the British the DNA is right through the intellect of the programmes. But it's an important thing to say, even though you may say it's small.
Forgive me, I called for arms exports to be suspended because I think we're in breach of our own arms export licence.
Yeah.
If it's not, to your point about being symbolic, this gentleman saying, how do we force it? Those things are symbolic. It's not going to make a difference.
Well, we do the things that we can. It doesn't mean we don't. We just do nothing about it. And we should have observed.
People are saying that we can force it in the chamber today. Labour was shouting at Andrew Mitchell as if there was something that he was choosing not to do that would actually make a difference on the ground.
Publish the advice. Let us see.
You never publish the advice.
So we work in a world of ignorance, whether we're in compliance with international humanitarian law or not. I mean that's not.
It was me
that
worked out that it was me that guided Parliament that you have to ask: is Israel demonstrating a commitment to international law? The Labour Party kept asking, is international humanitarian law being broken, when you knew that wasn't going to get you the answer. You know, I've guided Parliament to focus on what are the big questions that we have to ask to hold the government to account. But at the same time, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that there's some easy thing that we're just choosing not to do that would actually make a difference.
Well, okay, sorry.
Joe Twyman.
I don't think the UK can force the Israelis government to do anything. They can ask, they can request, they can make symbolic gestures, but they can't force the Israelis to do anything. Similarly, I don't think even the United States can force the Israelis to do anything.
The United States is in a very, very powerful position.
I don't doubt that, but on this, I don't think they can force the Israelis to have.
Well, what both countries can do, there's a vote coming up at the General Assembly of the United Nations, I think, in the course of the next 14 days, to the recognition of Palestine. That would be something to move the debate along.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, but the specific question was about forcing the Israeli government into a ceasefire. I do not believe that, certainly do not believe the United Kingdom can, and I doubt the United States can when it comes specifically to forcing. What I would like to say very briefly is about the view of the British public, which has been consistent, as it has been clear now for some time. There is an enormous amount of sympathy for the Israeli people. There is an enormous amount of sympathy for the people of Palestine, for the Palestinian people, and that is consistent throughout the period of this awful situation. What people in this country want to see is an end to civilian deaths, peace in the region longer term, and a release of hostages. How that is achieved, there are then disagreements. But in terms of the overall aim, the British public is very clear and very consistent.
Janet, I could almost sense you gagging to get in on this.
I have to declare I'm Jewish, I'm a Zionist, but I'm finding it almost unbearable to watch this carry on. But at the same time, I had no doubt that Israel was going to go ahead with the Rafah engagement. And they say it's targeted. I think probably Mossad had very specific information about what it was they were aiming at in Rafah, and they were saying that if we are not allowed to go into Rafah, in effect, this whole thing has been in vain. It's been for nothing because Hamas will not be stopped. Hamas is now effectively, they're saying, hold up in Rafah. And if they hadn't gone in and been able to clear that, there would have been no point. This would have seemed even more futile and pointless. What happens now? Hamas does not want a two-party solution. You have to bear that in mind. They have specifically said that they would reject a two-state solution. That presents a real logical problem for the whole argument about the answer to this is a two-state solution. It's also the case that your caller neglected the first chapter of this. He began with Israel's transgressions in October. He failed to mention what happened on the 7th of October. I mean, there is a tremendous sense in Israel that this is a repetition of the Holocaust, of the truly genocidal attacks on the Jewish population. And as a result, they feel that they cannot possibly allow this to persist. Now, I would counter that argument myself by saying you're never going to eliminate the ideology of Hamas by doing what you're doing, because you're effectively politicizing, radicalizing a whole new generation. So even if you wiped out every single Hamas officer and become combatant now, you have created an entirely new generation to replace them. That is, I can't see a way out of that.
If you as a Jewish Zionist woman can see that, why on earth can't the Israeli government?
They can, but it's a question of, as we all know, Netanyahu is in a terrible political position. On the one hand, he has quite an extreme hard-right party, sort of a clique in his cabinet, his war cabinet. On the other hand, he has the families of the hostages who are pleading with him to stop this, to allow the hostages to be released. But that isn't as simple as it seems, because we don't even know, and it seems as if Hamas doesn't even know, how many of these hostages are still alive, how many of them they could produce on demand. It became clear when the last time we had this sort of beginnings of a hostage release, that they weren't even able to trace all the hostages. They were being held by different people in different locations. So maybe the demand to release the hostages is hopeless. This is one of the worst, most tragic situations I can remember in my lifetime, because there is no solution. And does everybody just kill everybody else until finally people give up in exhaustion? And for outside forces to try to intervene in this just complicates the matter further, especially as Israel is to some extent fighting a proxy war against Iran on behalf of the West. They are the only people that, Iran finances Hamas, and so in a sense there is a kind of ambivalence. Do we want to let them carry on to the point where Iran becomes compromised and the Iranian government, the regime, becomes compromised? This is much more complicated politically than it seems.
Nick in Leeds says, Here, that woman, that's you, Janet, is spot on.
Oh.
So some praise there. Now, Alicia, you were, I could hear you sort of assenting to a lot of what Janet was saying there, but you have been, I think I'm right in saying, sort of slightly more Israel skeptic in this.
So the problem is you cannot bomb an ideology out of existence. This is the point. And we haven't learned from the past that where you needed a political settlement, we've gone for a military solution. I spent my career before I came into politics defeating terrorist groups. The way in which you do it can make you more safe or less safe. And unfortunately, the way in which Israel is choosing to prosecute this is making not just them, but also us less safe. I have been in bunkers with IDF soldiers. I have worked with the IDF. I know they can do this differently. And this is the point in Parliament.
Why aren't they then?
Because there is anger and there is appalling crimes against humanity that were committed on the 7th of October that are so egregious. But we also have a far-right, ultra-Orthodox extremist government currently in place. And in January last year, I warned that we were going to see the Gaza crisis of 2023. I wish I was wrong. I didn't see it happening as it did. And I warned that we had to learn how to be a critical friend to Israel. Friend is key, but the critical point, and you've seen that in the political discourse, that if you say that the way Israel's doing this, and the people in Parliament most angry at the way Israel's doing this are people who are ex-military ex-diplomatic service or counterterrorism understand that it can be done differently, because we want to see them succeed. We want to see peace in the Middle East, but there are choices about the way you prosecute things. And so I think it's really disappointing and deeply frustrating that you have people essentially not recognising that we do have to change the way you talk about this. If the US was doing the things that Israel is doing, the way they are doing some of their activities, people would be absolutely fine to be outspoken against it and speak about it. We want to see Israel succeed, but if the way they are doing it will make them less safe in the long term, then we have to speak out, please.
Can I just add one more point? Just before this began, the 7th of October crisis, the whole settlement in the Middle East was beginning to look quite good. Saudi Arabia was about to sign the Abraham Accords. It really looked as if the situation was gradually diminishing and petering out, if you like, if that isn't too trivial a term to use. And I suspect that this Hamas outrage of the 7th of October was designed to do precisely what it did do, which was to, throw a grenade into that whole process. And you have to bear in mind, too, that the neighbors of Israel, Egypt and Lebanon and so on, are not willing to take in Palestinian refugees. And there is a reason for that. And that is because they are regarded as potential terrorists who will disrupt. Those countries are desperate now for a kind of Western respectability. They're conducting film festivals. They're buying Hollywood, sort of franchises. They wanted to buy my newspaper. They want.
You put paid to that.
Yeah, I certainly did. Yeah, they are trying now to become respectable players on the world stage, and they do not want to have an injection of a fifth column.
But forgive me, that's also because they fear what they would call a third Napka. They fear that once the Palestinian people are forced out, they will never be able to return.
Just very briefly, I mean, what David Cameron said very wisely at the early part of this terrible tragedy was that the future for a safe Israel is only going to be secured once we have a safe and secure Palestine. And I think that was a very wise thing to say. But just in terms of I listened very carefully to Janet's comments around Hamas. Of course, Hamas are not the dominant force in the West Bank. We look from the outside and think, well, how far has that got them? That's got them the Palestinian people in a terrible situation, and the abuses there are legion. So we've got to find a way of breaking through this where there is that conversation and people who are willing to talk and observe just basic human dignities for people of whatever nationality.
Well, Israel might claim that by demolishing Hamas and its infrastructure, they might actually be liberating the Palestinian people in Gaza. Well, they could. I mean,
it's a little hard to take that when they're demolishing people's homes in the West Bank.
But Hamas has kept these people hostage for 20 years.
We've actually got a WhatsApp message from Tel Aviv, from Debbie, who says, do you really want arms sales to Israel and have the world taken over? I think she means abolish arms sales to Israel and have the world taken over by Iran and its proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah. Do you really believe Hamas figures on deaths? Why? There is a much bigger chance of not radicalising people if Hamas goes. Hamas can't find 40 hostages who are alive. Well, we'll move on from that because it's a really good discussion.
Can I make one 10-second point?
Very, very quickly.
But this is exactly the point about extremes. Either people say, arms exports will make no difference, or they say it's going to completely castrate Israel and you're going to see Hamas overrun the whole of Israel. It is not the two extremes. People need to be more measured in the way they respond to this and about the realities.